Harlan, did you go and fetch yourself a bride or a bookkeeper? The voice came from inside the Maverick Saloon, loose and loud, the kind of voice that knew it had an audience and liked the feeling. A few men turned on their stools. Then came the laughter, unhurried, satisfied, the laughter of a town that had already made up its mind. Cal Harlan stood in the dust of Uvalde's main street with his hat in both hands and the afternoon sun hitting the back of his neck like a judgment. He was 47 years old. He had ridden with the Texas Rangers for 19 years, had tracked men through the Pecos badlands in January, had been shot twice, and kept going both times. He had never once, in all those years, learned how to stop his face from going red. It went red now. He turned toward the train platform. The locomotive had stopped 3 minutes ago, exhaling white steam into the baked air. The other passengers had already moved on. A drummer with a sample case, 2 cowhands, a woman with a child on each hip. What remained on the platform was a single figure, compact and still, standing beside a carpet bag that was not large. Dora Mays, 36 years old, 5 feet and 2 inches. A gray traveling dress that had been pressed carefully and was now, after 2 days on the train from Nashville, no longer quite pressed. Hair pulled back so tight it looked like it had been calculated rather than arranged. And the glasses, wire-rimmed. One arm repaired with a length of copper wire so fine you almost didn't see it until the light caught it just right. She had heard the voice from the saloon. Of course she had. The street wasn't wide. She adjusted the glasses with one finger, pushing them a fraction of an inch down the bridge of her nose. She looked at the saloon. She looked at the men looking back. Then she looked at Cal, who was still holding his hat in both hands and hadn't said a word. If you have ever walked into a room where people had already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, you know exactly what Dora felt at that moment, the particular weight of it, the way it lands not in the chest, but somewhere lower, somewhere that takes longer to reach. Tell me in the comments if that feeling ever fully goes away, because I'm not sure it does. What she did not do, blush, tremble, look at the ground. What she did, picked up the carpetbag herself, as she had clearly done before and would clearly do again, and spoke to Cal in a voice that was unhurried and exact. "Which way is the ranch?" Cal blinked. "Ma'am, I can carry that." "I have it." She was already walking. "Which way?" He caught up to her in 3 strides, pointed west, and fell into step slightly behind her, a position he would not fully recognize for what it was until much later. From the saloon doorway, someone called something else. The words didn't matter. Nobody turned to answer. The woman in the gray dress didn't turn her head. The road to the Harlan ranch was 20 miles of red dust and cedar, and they covered the first 2 in silence so complete you could hear the wagon wheels working against the limestone caliche. Cal had prepared remarks in the loose way that men prepare remarks when they know they should say something and don't know what. He'd thought about explaining the letter he sent to Nashville, the parts he'd left out, the parts that were harder to put into words than he'd expected. He didn't explain anything. She sat straight on the wagon bench with the carpetbag at her feet and 2 small books wedged beside it. He caught the spine of one when the wagon hit a rut. Euclid. He didn't know what to do with that, so he looked back at the road. The air smelled of cedar and warming limestone and something sharper underneath. The faint mineral bite of the Nueces River, cutting south somewhere out of sight. In June, Uvalde went from warm to hot between breakfast and midday to honest punishment by mid-afternoon. There were hawks up. The scrubland stretched in every direction, pale and unhurried and indifferent to anything Cal Harlan had ever wanted from it. After a while she said, without preamble, "How long have you had the loan?" Not quite a question. Cal kept his eyes on the mare's ears. "Going on 2 years? Same bank the whole time?" "Pruitt's bank. Only one in the county." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "And the terms were explained to you clearly when you signed." The way she said it, not accusing, not gentle either, just precise, the way a person checks a figure in a column, was the thing that made his jaw tighten. "I signed what they put in front of me," he said. "I was in a fair amount of pain that week." She turned and looked at him just briefly. He didn't look back. The bay mare plodded on. The ranch came into view around the 3rd hour. The gate first, one post leaning, the other straight. Then the fence line that needed work on the south quarter. Then the house itself, low and solid, built to last and showing what that meant after 20 years of being asked to prove it. Beyond it, the pasture where 40 head grazed in the late afternoon haze. To Cal, it looked like failure arranged across 200 acres. He didn't say that. Men like Cal Harlan didn't say things like that. They looked at a sagging fence post and said they'd been meaning to get to it. They looked at a dry water tank and said the summer had been dry. They looked at a stack of bank papers on a desk and looked away, because looking didn't help. And the alternative to looking away was understanding what the paper said. And that was a door Cal had kept closed. Dora Mays, from the wagon bench, was already looking at the fence line. She had done this her whole life, looked at a thing not for what it was, but for what the numbers behind it were saying. Her father had taught her that, or tried to. He had been a quiet man with steady hands and a talent for figures that he'd never quite known what to do with until his eyesight went at 51. And then it was Dora, 11 years old, sitting beside him at the kitchen table with a ledger between them while he told her what to write. She had learned double-entry bookkeeping before she learned to sew. She had been keeping the books of J.E. Mays, accountant, Nashville, for 25 years. She had done it through her marriage, which was brief and not unkind, and ended at Chickamauga in September of '63, and through the years after, which were longer and quieter, and eventually empty. There was nothing left in Nashville for a woman who spoke in numbers. She had written to 6 men before she wrote to Cal Harlan. His letter was the only one that didn't ask about her appearance in the first paragraph. Cal tied the mare at the post by the porch and climbed down. He carried both his bag and the carpet bag this time, and she let him, because they had arrived and some courtesies had their place. He showed her the spare room, small, a window with a cotton curtain, a bed with a clean quilt his neighbor Mrs. Aldine had sent over without being asked. He'd been grateful for the quilt in the way that a man is grateful for anything that suggests someone still thinks he's worth a small gesture. He stood in the doorway. She stood by the window, looking out at the pasture, at the fence line, at the gate they'd come through with its one leaning post. The light was going gold over the chaparral. Somewhere in the east pasture, cattle moved with the slow, indifferent patience that cattle have always had, and that Cal had always found faintly comforting. He was about to say something about supper. He was about to say something about the sleeping arrangements, which were plainly what they were. This room for her, the other room for him, and which he had rehearsed how to mention without making it strange. She said, "Mr. Harlan," before anything else, "where do you keep the deed to this property?" The question landed so quietly that for a second he wasn't sure he'd heard it right. Not, "Is there somewhere I can wash up?" Not, "When do you eat supper?" Not anything he had braced for. The deed. "The deed," he repeated, "the original deed of title." She had turned from the window, and in the dimness of the room her eyes were steady behind the wire-mended glasses. "And the loan papers, if you have them here, I'd like to see them before it gets dark." Cal Harlan had been a Texas Ranger for 19 years. He had read men in darkness and terrain and rain and situations that other men walked into blind. He had never, in all of that, learned to read a contract. He knew this about himself, the way a man knows a thing he has decided not to look at directly. He answered before he thought to ask why. "Top drawer of the desk," he said, "in the front room." She walked past him into the hallway. He stood in the doorway of the spare room a moment longer, listening to the sound of the desk drawer opening, wood on wood, the dry scrape of it in the heat, and then the rustle of papers. Outside, the last light was going amber over the chaparral. The hawk he'd seen from the road was gone. 40 head grazed without hurry in the far pasture, the way cattle do when they don't know anything is wrong. Cal Harlan stood very still and thought about a woman who came off a train with 2 volumes of Euclid and mended glasses, and asked about the deed before she asked about the bed. He hadn't answered the question she was really asking yet. He wasn't sure standing there that he wanted to. The deed was in a cigar box on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet, next to a tin of coffee and a Bible with a broken spine. Cal watched her take it down, watched her set the cigar box on the kitchen table as if she'd been given permission, which she hadn't, and open it as if she had every right to, which was debatable. She removed the papers inside with a care he had not seen applied to those papers before. He'd looked at them twice himself, once the afternoon he'd signed, and once a month ago when the first letter from Pruitt's office had arrived about the overdue installment. Both times they had meant nothing to him beyond the number at the bottom, the one with the $sign in front of it. "Sit down if you want," he said, because he felt that someone should say something, and the silence was starting to have a texture to it. She sat. She did not look up. He stood. He poured himself coffee that he didn't want and leaned against the counter and watched her read. She read the way some men read a landscape, systematically from edge to edge, not skimming, going back when something stopped her. Her pen moved in her ledger at intervals. She turned a page. She went back to the first page. She turned a different page and stopped, and her pen moved again. 14 minutes. He counted roughly because he had nothing else to do. She looked up. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the saloon, not with contempt, just with assessment. "When did you sign this?" she said. "February," he said, "after the surgery." Something shifted very slightly in her face. "You were still recovering." "I was upright." She looked back at the paper. "There's a clause in Section 7, she said, "the penalty clause. Under what circumstances would you say you understood it when you signed?" He put the coffee down. "I understood I was borrowing money against the ranch and I had to pay it back at 5%. And the timeline. 30 days to repay after a default notice. She turned the paper slightly and pointed at a line near the bottom of the third page, a line he had read without reading it, the way you read the small print at the bottom of a posted notice. This language here, she said, converts the 30-day notice period into an immediate execution clause if the default exceeds a single payment. One missed payment, not two, not three. 1. The bank files at the courthouse the following business day. She paused. You told me in your letter you'd missed 3. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its afternoon repertoire in the cedar by the water trough, cycling through other bird songs one at a time, like it was running through a list. I told you what was in the letter I got from Pruitt's office, Cal said. I don't know if that clause is... It's in the contract, she said. She tapped the paper once. Whether or not it's legal under the 1876 statutes is a different question. She looked at him. Do you have copies of the letters from the bank? He found them in the same cigar box, folded underneath the deed. She read them too. She added more notes to her ledger. He thought about eating something and decided against it, and sat down across from her at the table because standing was starting to make him feel like a man waiting for a verdict. Miss Mays, he said, I asked you here because I needed someone who could cook and help manage the household accounts, and I know what you asked me here for, she said. She didn't look up. I'm not sure this is Mr. Harlan. She put her pen down carefully and looked at him. I read contracts for 16 years, starting at 11 years old when my father's eyes got bad enough that he couldn't do it himself, and I was the only one in the house. I can read the one in front of me. Would you like to know what I found, or would you like me to finish unpacking? The mockingbird switched to something that sounded like a red-tailed hawk. The afternoon light was coming in low through the west window and laying itself across the table in a long yellow stripe. What did you find? Cal said. She nodded once, as if he'd finally answered a question she'd been holding for a while. The clause is irregular, she said. It may also be unenforceable under Texas property law as it was amended 4 years ago. But I would need to see comparable contracts. Specifically, I'd need to know if this language appears only in your agreement or in others Pruitt has filed. She looked at him steadily. You know the other ranches in the county. I know them. Have any of them done business with the same bank? He thought about what he knew and what he'd heard and what he'd stopped listening to when his own troubles got loud enough to drown everything else out. There was the Hadley widow, who'd lost the east parcel of her property last year, the Vasquez family, who had sold their cattle far below market value and left in January. 2 or 3 others, names and faces that floated up now with new weight attached to them. Some of them, he said. She picked up her pen. Then I'll need to speak with them, she said. Not tomorrow, this week if possible. She wrote something in her ledger and closed it. Now, she folded her hands on top of the ledger. Where is my room? He showed her. He stood in the hallway after she closed the door and listened to the sound of her opening her carpetbag. He could still hear the mockingbird outside. He thought about the clause in Section 7 and the number of months he'd been behind, and the fact that a woman he'd known for roughly 4 hours had identified something in those papers that 2 readings of his own had missed entirely. He went back to the kitchen and looked at the deed still on the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went out to the barn to check on the horses, because he needed to do something with his hands. She was up before he was the next morning. He found her at the kitchen table with the same ledger and a cup of coffee she had made herself from whatever she'd found in the tin, and a sheet of paper in front of her with names written in a column. His neighbors' names. "I made a list," she said without looking up. "The ones you mentioned and 2 others I found in the county records. Do you know if any of them borrowed from Pruitt's bank in the last 3 years?" He looked at the list. She'd written the names in the order that made geographical sense for riding out to visit them. Shortest route between properties. He hadn't told her where the properties were. She'd worked it out some other way. "Where did you find the county records?" he said. "I went to the courthouse yesterday evening while you were in the barn." She turned a page. The clerk wasn't helpful at first. He improved. He looked at her. She was reading something in her ledger. Her hair was pinned up with more precision than the day before, and she had changed into a different dress, dark blue with small buttons at the wrist. Her coffee cup was half empty. "I'll harness the wagon," he said. He didn't ask her what she'd said to the courthouse clerk to make him improve. He had a feeling that what she'd done was simply waited until the clerk ran out of reasons not to help her, which was a technique he'd used himself in law enforcement and recognized when he saw it employed. The first stop was the Hadley property, 3 miles north on the Sabinal Road. Ruth Hadley was 61 and had run the ranch alone since her husband had died of a rattler bite in '74. She was the kind of woman who sized you up in the first 10 seconds and had usually finished forming an opinion by the 22nd, and the opinion she formed of Dora in that first half minute was clearly not the same one the Maverick Saloon had formed, because she invited them onto the porch and brought out coffee without being asked. "The east parcel," Dora said after introductions were done. "You sold it last year." "Didn't exactly sell it," Ruth said. She looked at Cal. "You know how that went?" "I heard some of it," he said. He hadn't really. "Pruitt's bank held the note," Ruth said. "When Thomas died, I thought I had 60 days to sort things out. Turns out I had 30, and then I had 2 weeks. And then I had a letter saying the east parcel was being applied to the outstanding balance." She said it the way you say something you've explained too many times, flatly, with the emotion packed down underneath. "I didn't know to fight it. My son said, 'Let it go.'" "Do you still have the contract?" Dora said. Ruth looked at her. "I might have it somewhere." "Why?" Dora told her. "Not everything. Just enough. The clause in Cal's contract, the language about the immediate execution, the question of whether it appeared elsewhere." Ruth went inside and came back with a coffee tin of her own and a document she unfolded on the porch table between the coffee cups. Dora read it. She found what she was looking for in less than a minute. She pointed to it without commenting and looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at the line and looked at Dora and said, "Is that—" "I'm not certain yet," Dora said. "I need to see more." They saw 3 more properties that day. 2 of the owners were home. 1 was not. Of the 2 they spoke to, both had borrowed from Pruitt's bank. Both still had their contracts. Both contracts had the same clause, word for word, down to the punctuation. On the drive back, Cal said nothing for a long time. The sun was going down behind the limestone hills to the west, turning the chaparral the color of old copper, and he drove with the reins loose in his hands and let the horses find their own pace. "How many contracts do you think he's filed?" he said finally. "I don't know yet," she said. She was writing in the ledger, the pen moving with the rhythm of the wagon. "I need to see the recorded deeds at the land office, the ones where the property changed hands in the last 5 years. I want to cross-reference the previous owners against Pruitt's loan records." "The land office might not let you see the loan records." "The loan records are public if there's a recorded lien," she said. "Most people don't know that." She turned a page. "Your friend Oakes, the lawyer in town. Is he a man of conscience or a man of accommodation?" He thought about Cecil Oakes, who had drawn up his will 6 years ago and charged him fairly for it. "Conscience," he said. "Mostly." "Good," she said. She wrote something. "We'll need him." He looked at the road. The horses' ears turned forward and back in the way they did when they were satisfied with the pace and the direction and the company. "Miss Mays," he said. "Yes." "When you said the clause might be unenforceable under the 1876 amendment," he paused. "How sure are you?" She considered this with the same attention she gave everything. 70%, she said. 80, if the records show what I think they show. He nodded. He supposed that was as good as anything he'd ridden toward on a $100-to-1 chance. "And if you're wrong," he said. "Then I'm wrong, and you lose the ranch," she said pleasantly. "But you were going to lose it anyway, so the expected value of looking is higher than the expected value of not looking." He turned that over. He didn't entirely understand the phrasing, but he understood the logic. The ranch came into view past the low ridge, the windmill turning slow and patient in the evening wind. She closed her ledger and put it in her carpet bag and held the bag on her lap with both hands. "I'll need 3 more days," she said. "Possibly 4. He brought the wagon to a stop. "Take whatever you need," he said. She climbed down. She went inside. He sat in the wagon for another minute, looking at the fence on the west pasture, the posts that leaned, and the wire that ran wrong. And he thought about the clause in Section 7, and about Ruth Hadley's coffee tin, and about the fact that all of it, the fence and the tin and the clause and the cattle count that had never added up, might be connected in a way he had never thought to consider. He unhooked the horses in the failing dark. From inside the house, through the open window, he could see the lamplight at the kitchen table and the shadow of a woman bent over her work. She was still going. Cecil Oakes had been the attorney of record in Uvalde County for 31 years, which meant he had outlasted 3 county judges, 2 droughts that most people said would finish the town, and 1 attempted bank robbery, in which he had sat very still behind his desk until it was over. He was a small man with a precise mustache and the habit of writing everything down before he said it, which Dora understood to be the habit of a man who had learned to trust paper over memory. He read what she showed him twice. Then he read the section she had marked. He put the paper down and looked at the window. "I've never drawn up a contract with that clause," he said. "I know," Dora said. "I looked at yours, the ones filed in the last 6 years. Different language entirely." She folded her hands. "This came from somewhere else." "Pruitt brought in a man from Houston 3 years ago," Cal said. "New clerk for the lending operation, fancy education." He looked at the floor. Everybody thought it was a good sign, bank hiring quality people. Oakes said nothing. He picked up the document again and looked at the clause and put it down again. Under the amendment to the 1876 Code, he said slowly, a 30-day notice clause in a mortgage instrument is mandatory, non-negotiable. A lender can't waive it through a contractual addendum. That's been a settled law since Higgins versus the Brazoria County Trust. He paused. But I'd have to verify the date of the filing against the amendment's effective date. January 1st, 1877, Dora said. The amendment was published in the Gazette in November 1876. Cal signed in February of this year. Ruth Hadley signed in March 1876, which is before the amendment, so hers is more complicated. The other two we saw signed in 77 and 78, both after the cutoff. Oakes looked at her over the paper. He said nothing for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "My father lost his accounting practice to a contract with similar language in Tennessee in 1868, she said. I was 25. I understood what had happened. I didn't have the standing to do anything about it." The office was quiet. Out on the street, a wagon went by, iron wheels on limestone, and then it was quiet again. "If I can establish the full picture," she said, "can you file a petition for injunctive relief? Something that stops the bank from acting on any default during the review period?" Oakes looked at Cal. Cal looked back. "Get me the documents," Oakes said. "All of them. Every contract you can find." He pulled a notepad from his desk drawer. "And Miss Mays, if you're right about this, the men whose land is already gone may have a claim for recovery. That's a longer fight, but it's a fight worth having." She nodded once. She stood and held out her hand. He shook it. On the way back to the ranch, Cal rode a long time without talking. The country looked the same as it always had. The scrub and the cedar and the pale limestone and the hazy blue distance where Texas just kept going, unhurried and indifferent. He had ridden this road more times than he could count, and he had always thought of it as the road home. In the last 6 months, he had started thinking of it as the road to what used to be home. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes." When you got on the train in Nashville," he considered his words, "you knew the kind of situation a man puts in a matrimonial letter is usually the best version of the truth." "Usually," she said. "So you came anyway." She looked out at the scrubland. A roadrunner crossed the caliche ahead of them and disappeared into the cedar. "I'd had enough of Nashville," she said, "and I had a feeling—" She paused. Numbers, when they're wrong, have a particular feel to them, like a floorboard that sounds different underfoot. You don't always know what it means right away, but you know the sound. He thought about that. "And you heard that sound when you read my letter?" "I heard something." She turned to look at him, and her expression was not unkind. "I didn't know if it was your numbers that were wrong or someone else's numbers with your name on them. That's what I came to find out." He nodded slowly. The following days took on a shape that neither of them had planned or discussed. Dora went to the land office every morning, sometimes with Cal, sometimes without. She was building something in her ledger. He could tell by the way she turned pages and went back and turned forward again, the way the notes grew denser. At the kitchen table in the evenings, by lamplight, she would spread her copies across the oilcloth, and Cal would sit across from her while she explained what she was finding, and he would listen the way he'd learned to listen out in the field, quietly, noting what mattered, not interrupting. She taught him to find a penalty clause. He taught her the creek crossings between the eastern properties, which ones could be forded dry and which ones became impassable after rain. He taught her to check a horse's hock for heat. She told him that the word usury, while not technically applicable here, was the right emotional category for what Pruitt had constructed. One evening, Ruth Hadley brought over a dried apple cake and stayed for coffee, and looked at them both across the table with the frank appraisal of a woman who had made her assessments for 6 decades and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. When Dora went to refill the pot, Ruth leaned forward and said to Cal quietly, "She came a long way to help you. You know that." "I know it," he said. "I'm not sure you do," she said. "I'm not sure you see it yet." He didn't answer because he wasn't certain she was wrong. That night, he sat on the porch after supper, and she came out and stood at the railing, the way she sometimes did when the work in the ledger had reached a point where more work wouldn't help, and she needed to let the accumulated information settle. The Nueces country at night had a particular quality of silence, deep and filled with smaller sounds, the frogs and the owls and the distant coyotes, that he had come to think of as one of the few things in his life that was entirely reliable. "What do you expect to happen," he asked, "when you have everything you need?" She considered this. "I expect that the petition goes to court," she said. "I expect that Cecil Oakes reads the statute correctly and the judge reads it after him. I expect that the men who still have their land get to keep it." She paused. "I expect that the men who've already lost theirs will have a harder road." "And Pruitt?" "I expect he loses the license," she said. "I don't expect anything more dramatic than that." She was quiet for a while. A nighthawk made its dipping call somewhere over the cedar. "What I expect," she said, "and what I would like are 2 different things." He looked at the darkness where his western fence line was. The fence he now knew was wrong. "What would you like?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was quiet. "I would like for it to have been worth the trouble." He didn't ask what trouble. He thought he understood. They sat on the porch for a while after that, not talking. The coyotes moved off somewhere north, and the frogs took over, and the windmill turned in a slow, creaking circle. It was a comfortable silence, which was something Cal had not experienced in a very long time and did not quite have words for. The next morning, she was up before him again. "I need to go back to the land office," she said when he came into the kitchen. "I need 3 more deeds. After that, I'll have everything." She was at the table, already dressed, her ledger open. "I think I have enough, but I want 3 more. He nodded. He started the coffee. She looked up from the ledger. "Cal," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, and she either didn't notice or had decided this was the appropriate moment for it. "Yes," he said. "We need to be careful," she said. "The courthouse clerk is not discreet." She was right to be careful. Gerald Pruitt had not gotten where he was by being inattentive. He had a 6th sense for the particular current in a room that meant someone was asking questions about him. And that sense had been humming at the back of his neck for 10 days. The land office clerk was a young man named Delbert, the same Delbert who had called from the saloon doorway when the stage came in. He owed Pruitt a favor, The kind of favor that doesn't get repaid so much as it gets called in, whenever and in whatever form the creditor finds useful. On a Thursday morning in late June, Pruitt found it useful in the form of a quiet conversation over coffee at the back table of the Maverick. He listened to what Delbert told him about a woman from Nashville who had been requesting deed records for 2 weeks running, who took careful notes, who had asked about 6 specific properties by name. He finished his coffee. "She'll be in again tomorrow," Delbert said. "She said she needs 3 more." Pruitt nodded. He was not alarmed. He was the kind of man who had built his operation specifically to be alarm-resistant. The clauses buried in language that took a trained eye to find. The loan relationships scattered among enough individual transactions that you'd need to assemble them all before the pattern became visible. A woman from Nashville with a notebook was a complication, not a catastrophe. He just needed to know what she had. Meanwhile, 4 miles west on the Nueces Road, Dora Mays had spread 6 loan contracts, 3 warranty deeds, 4 sheriff's-to-sale filings, and her own 19-page analysis across the kitchen table, and was reading them in order to Cecil Oakes, who sat across from her with a pencil moving continuously. Cal sat in the corner by the window where the afternoon light was best. He had taken to sitting there when she worked, not to help, because there was nothing he could add to what she was doing, but because not being present felt wrong in a way he didn't entirely understand. "These are the 6 contracts," she said, setting them on the left side. "Same clause, 7.3 in every one, signed between March of 1876 and February of this year." She moved the 3 warranty deeds to the center. "These are the 3 properties where Pruitt's bank filed the sheriff's sale: Ruth Hadley's east parcel, the Vasquez property on the Frio, and the north section of the Barton homestead. In all 3 cases, the notice of default was filed the day after the first missed payment, not 30 days after." Oakes was writing. "The amendment," she said, "took effect on January 1st of 1877. 2 of the 3 sheriff's sales occurred after that date." She pushed the 2 relevant filings to the front, which means the bank executed foreclosure on properties using a clause that was legally void at the time of execution. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind was working in the cedar the way it always did in the late afternoon, a slow, searching sound, and the windmill had started turning. Oakes looked up from his notepad. "If this analysis is correct," he said, "and the statutes say what you say they say, the statutes are published," she said. "I've cited the relevant sections on page 14. He turned to page 14. He read for a while. Cal watched his face for the thing that would tell him whether Dora was right, the kind of involuntary expression that a man trained in the law tries to manage and rarely completely succeeds at managing. He saw it, small, a slight tightening around the eyes, the kind of expression a man has when something fits together in a way he wishes someone had told him sooner. "Miss Mays," Oakes said. He set the notepad down and looked at her. "This is the most thorough analysis of a predatory lending structure I have seen in 31 years of practice in this county." He paused. "And I will be honest with you, I should have seen this myself." "You weren't looking for it," she said, without judgment. "You don't look for something you don't know is there." "Your father," he said. "What happened in Tennessee?" "He lost the accounting practice," she said. "The bank took the building. He died in 67. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and has been true long enough that the particular pain of it has settled into the same category as weather or distance. Not gone, just familiar. I was 24. I couldn't have done this then. I didn't know enough. Oakes looked at her for a moment. You know enough now, he said. She inclined her head once, a precise acknowledgement. Can you file? She asked. I can file a petition for injunctive relief by Monday, he said. That stops the bank from acting on any existing default while the matter is under review. He looked at Cal. That gives you the ranch. Cal looked at the analysis spread across his kitchen table. 19 pages in Dora's careful hand, the column of contracts on the left, the warranty deeds in the center, the figures he had spent 2 years not understanding because no one had told him they were worth understanding. He thought about saying something. He couldn't find words with the right weight. What about Hadley? He said finally. The Vasquez family? Oakes closed his notepad. The recovery claims are harder. The property's already changed hands, legally, on paper, because the clause was on paper, even if it wasn't enforceable. We'll argue restitution. He looked at Dora. That's a longer fight. I know, she said. She began gathering the documents in order, returning them to their sequence. I brought copies of everything. The originals are in my room. There was a sound from the road, a horse being ridden harder than the heat warranted. Cal went to the window. A rider was coming fast from the direction of town. It was young Tom Barton, whose father had lost the north section. He pulled up in the yard in a cloud of dust and looked at the house. Mr. Harlan, he called. Miss Mays? Cal opened the door. Pruitt knows, Tom said. He was breathing hard. Delbert from the land office. He told him. Pruitt was at the Maverick an hour ago. He was asking who she'd talked to. The kitchen behind Cal went very still. Then Dora said clearly from the table, How much did she copy before Delbert noticed? Tom looked at her. All of it, he said. She said to tell you, all of it's copied. She, Tom's sister, who worked at the land office on Tuesdays and Thursdays and who had been watching what Dora was doing with a very particular attention for 2 weeks. Dora turned back to the table. She made a small sound, not triumph, something quieter than that. Then we have everything, she said. The petition was filed on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Pruitt knew about it. He came to the ranch himself that evening, not with a lawyer, not with a deputy. Alone, which was a choice Cal noticed and did not quite know how to read. A man who comes alone is either not worried or is sending a message that he doesn't need to be. Pruitt was the kind of man who understood that the message was its own kind of leverage. He was 52, well dressed for the heat, cream linen, good hat, boots that hadn't spent much time in stirrups. He stood in the yard and asked to speak with Cal privately. Cal told him Dora was party to any conversation about ranch business. Pruitt looked at her for a moment, the look a man gives to a piece of furniture that has been moved to an inconvenient place. And then he looked back at Cal. What she's filed, Pruitt said, is an allegation. A petition is not a ruling. No, Cal agreed. Courts move slowly. Your payment is 4 months past due. If the petition is dismissed, even on a procedural question, even something minor, the foreclosure can proceed. Pruitt paused. He was a man who had learned to let silence work for him. I can be patient, Cal. I can wait this out. The question is whether you can. I seem to be managing, Cal said. Pruitt smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that didn't reach far. I can make this very difficult, he said, for both of you. He looked at Dora again, longer this time. She came a long way to make trouble in a county that doesn't know her. A word in the right places that she's not what she presented herself as, that her credentials don't hold up, that she and the attorney have a prior arrangement that calls her analysis into question. Those are lies, Dora said. Most of what moves through a small town is lies, Pruitt said pleasantly. What matters is which ones people believe. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, addressing Cal only, drop the petition. I'll extend the payment timeline by 6 months. You keep the ranch, you get clear of this, and the whole county forgets anyone was ever stirring anything up. He paused. Think about it tonight. There's no reason this has to go any further. He tipped his hat and rode back to town. Cal stood in the yard after the sound of the horse faded. The last of the sun was going behind the hills, and the sky was the particular dark amber that it got in that last half hour before dark, when everything seemed briefly lit from within and then wasn't. Dora was at his shoulder. He's right that courts move slowly, she said. Her voice was level. I know it. And the things he said about smearing the petition, about my credentials. She looked at the road. He could do some of that, not all of it, but enough to slow Oaks down. Cal looked at the fence on the west pasture, the fence that was wrong. He'd known it was wrong for 2 years, some wordless part of him that read the land the way she read columns of figures, and he'd done nothing because knowing something is wrong and having the words to name what's wrong are different things entirely. Dora, he said. She waited. Let it go, he said. He said it quietly, not to convince himself, but because he couldn't find another way to say what he meant. I am afraid. I have been afraid for a long time. I am not as brave as you are. She looked at him. He couldn't quite meet her eyes. All right, Harlan, she said. She went inside. He stayed in the yard. The dark came up fast, the way it does in that country. No long twilight, just the amber and then the stars, all at once and everywhere. He sat on the porch steps and looked at nothing in particular and thought about a number of things. The petition and Pruitt's smile and the look Oaks had given him across the kitchen table when she'd cited the page 14 amendment, and the 19-page analysis in Dora's careful hand still laid across the kitchen table inside. He thought about Billy Marsh, who had died because Cal had made a judgment call that was 9/10 right and 1/10 wrong, and how the 1/10 had ended everything. He had spent 4 years measuring that against the 9/10 and finding the math unsatisfying. He thought about Dora at the courthouse clerk's desk on the first morning, improving the clerk through the sheer unreasonable patience of a woman who knew what she was looking for and had decided she was going to find it. Inside, there was no sound. No lamp flickered in the window. He went to the door and listened. Nothing. She was not at the table. He went to his room and lay down on top of the covers in his boots and looked at the ceiling and thought about Ruth Hadley's east parcel and the Vasquez family who had taken their cattle south in January, and the north section of the Barton homestead, and all the other things that Pruitt had arranged so quietly for so long that the county had stopped noticing they were arrangements. He did not sleep, At some point, he didn't know what hour, he heard a sound from the spare room, not a distress sound, a page turning, a pen on paper. She was working. He lay there and listened to the sound of her pen moving in the dark, the soft occasional whisper of a page turning and another beginning. She was working in the dark, or by a candle she hadn't lit for the window. She was working. He understood then, in the way that things become clear when you stop trying to understand them, that she had not agreed. She had said all right, because she was not a woman who fought a battle in the enemy's territory on the enemy's timeline. She had said all right, because there are things it is prudent to agree to out loud while your hands keep moving in the dark. And because she had been doing exactly that since she was 11 years old, and because Gerald Pruitt had made a predictable kind of mistake, he had assumed that her silence was surrender. Cal closed his eyes. He thought, she already sent it. He thought, she's not copying now. She's already sent the copies somewhere. He thought, if I had trusted her from the beginning, none of this fear would have had anywhere to land. He fell asleep before he finished the thought. In the spare room, the pen moved on. 2 mornings later, a rider arrived before breakfast. He carried a letter from Austin, from the Texas General Land Office, addressed to Miss D.A. Mays, in care of C.A. Harlan, Uvalde County. She opened it at the breakfast table. She read it twice. She set it down. The land office is sending a commissioner, she said. He'll be here next week. She looked at Cal. I sent copies of the full analysis to Austin before Pruitt came to talk to you. 3 weeks ago. She said it without apology and without defiance, just as a fact that deserved to be stated clearly. I thought it was likely he would try something like that conversation. Cal said nothing for a long moment. You thought, he said. I calculated, she said. The word moved through Uvalde the way word always moves through a small town, fast, and in several wrong directions simultaneously before it settles into the shape it's going to keep. What people heard first was that a woman from Nashville had filed something at the courthouse against Pruitt's bank. What they heard next was that the land office in Austin had sent someone. What they heard after that depended on who they'd spoken to and whether they owed Pruitt money, which covered a fair number of people and divided them accordingly. By Thursday evening, Pruitt had convened a meeting at the Maverick Saloon. He was good at these meetings. He had the rancher's vocabulary, plain speech, no ornamentation, the language of a man who understood the land and the people on it. He bought a round first, which costs almost nothing and buys almost everything, and then he stood at the front of the room and said that the county was being interfered with by outside forces with no understanding of how things worked here, and that a woman with a ledger and a lawyer was not the same thing as a problem being solved, and that what Uvalde needed was to trust the institutions that had served it well for 30 years. There were perhaps 30 men in the room. Cal was not one of them. Tom Barton was, and Ruth Hadley's son Frank, and 6 or 7 of the ranchers who had borrowed from Pruitt's bank at one point and paid it back, and still thought of him as a reasonable man. Pruitt said the analysis that this woman had prepared was the work of someone with an agenda, not a credential. He said that a woman who had come to Uvalde without a license to practice accounting, without a formal surveying commission, without standing in this county's court system, was being taken seriously because she was married to a man who had been foolish enough to fall behind on a legitimate loan, and that the rest of Uvalde should not be asked to suffer consequences for one man's financial failures. He said it pleasantly. He had a gift for making cruelty sound like logics. Tom Barton left during the third sentence and went to find his sister. Frank Hadley sat through the whole thing and then went home and sat on his mother's porch for an hour without speaking, and then he said, "I'm going to talk to the woman." And Ruth said, "I know," and poured him coffee. There were 6 men in the room who said nothing, and 6 who laughed at Pruitt's jokes, and 4 who asked questions that were really just a different way of agreeing with him. And then there was one man, Abe Vasquez, son of the family that had sold their cattle and gone south in January, who had come back to Uvalde for reasons his family didn't know yet, and who stood up in the back of the room and said, quietly and without drama, "My father signed the same contract, the same clause, and we lost our herd." The room went still. Pruitt looked at him with the precise quality of a man who has identified a problem. That, Pruitt said, was a separate matter entirely. Abe Vasquez did not sit down. He did not speak again either. He just stood there until Pruitt had finished, and then he walked out, and 2 other men followed him. That night, there were more men on the porch of the Harlan ranch than there had been since Cal bought it. He hadn't invited them. They came because they'd heard, and because in a county where Pruitt owned the narrative, the Harlan ranch was the only place where a different accounting was being kept. Dora was not flustered by this. She brought out coffee in the largest pot they had, and then she went back inside and worked, because the work was what mattered, and the men on the porch could talk to Cal. Cal talked to them. He told them what he knew, the clause, the amendment, the timeline, the way it fit together. He said it plainly, without her precision, but without her patience either, in the way a man explains a thing he has had to work to understand. By 11 o'clock, they were gone. He came inside. She was at the table. 7 men, he said, counting Abe Vasquez. 3 of them have contracts with Pruitt's bank that nobody's looked at yet. He poured what was left in the coffee pot. It was cold. They want to come to the hearing. She looked up from the analysis. "The commissioner sets the date," she said. "We don't control when. They'll come whenever he sets it." She considered this. "Good," she said. She turned to Paige. "Cal." "Yes. When you told me to let it go." She looked at him steadily, and her expression was the same even quality it always had, but something in it was slightly different from its usual quality, more direct or more present. "Why did you say it?" He sat down. "Because I was afraid," he said. He thought about dressing it up somehow and then didn't. "I've been afraid for 6 months of losing the ranch and of what losing it means, which is that I ran out of things to hold on to a long time ago, and the ranch was the last one." He paused, and when Pruitt talked, part of me thought, he's going to win. He always wins. That's what men like him do. He looked at the table. I thought, I'm going to make her lose for me. Dora was quiet. "That's not what happened," she said. "No," he said, "it's not." She closed the ledger. "A city that decides who you are before you walk in," she said, "that's not actually about you. It never is. It's about what they've decided they need to see." She put the pencil down. Pruitt needed everyone to see a foolish woman with a notebook. If they saw that, they wouldn't look at the notebook. She paused. The Maverick Saloon believed him. A few others believed him. But Abe Vasquez didn't, and Tom Barton's sister didn't, and Ruth Hadley didn't. She met his eyes. The ones who needed to believe the truth already did. He thought about that. "There's a word for what you did," he said. "Coming anyway, knowing what you were walking into." "There's a word for a lot of things," she said. She picked up her pencil again. "Mostly, I just made calculations." He didn't answer. He sat across the table from her in the lamplight while the night settled fully over Uvalde County and the coyotes started up somewhere north of the cedar, and he thought about how rare it is to be wrong about something in a way that turns out to be useful, to mistake someone's patience for resignation and discover later that the patience had been doing more work than he'd understood. He was still thinking about it when she set down her pencil and said, "The commissioner arrives Tuesday. Oakes confirmed it this afternoon while you were out." She turned the last page of the analysis and reviewed it once. "I'm ready," she said. The McLennan County Courthouse was a 2-story limestone building on the square that smelled of old paper and turpentine and the particular weight of accumulated decisions. The commissioner from Austin had asked for a formal review hearing rather than a private meeting, which Oakes had told Dora was a good sign and which she had received without visible reaction. They arrived early. Half the county arrived before noon. Cal had not expected that. He'd expected the ranchers who'd come to the porch, Abe Vasquez and Tom Barton and Frank Hadley, and the 3 others with the unexamined contracts. He had not expected the widow Aldine, or the school teacher, or the 2 women from the Methodist congregation who had no direct stake in the matter and had come anyway. He had not expected the young men who'd been in the Maverick when Pruitt made his speech, a few of whom stood now on the opposite side of the room from Pruitt's attorney without quite looking at either. Pruitt was there with a lawyer from San Antonio, a different genus of man than Oakes, expensively suited, with a briefcase that looked like it had never held anything except power and precedent. Dora stood at the front of the room beside the commissioner's table. She had dressed carefully that morning. Her good dress, the dark blue with the small buttons, pressed without fuss the night before. Her hair was the same as always. She had the ledger under her arm and the 19-page analysis and the 6 contracts and the 3 warranty deeds and the copies of the statutes, all in order. The commissioner was a man named Aldridge, 60, with the spare systematic quality of someone who had spent his career reading land records and had developed the ability to read people in the same way, methodically, not with warmth or coldness, just accurately. He called the hearing to order. Oakes presented the petition. He was clear and thorough and cited the statutes correctly. Pruitt's San Antonio attorney objected 4 times in the first 20 minutes, all on procedural grounds, all overruled. Then Aldridge looked at Dora. "The analysis," he said, "walk me through it." She walked him through it. She started with the statute and explained it in plain language, the way her father had taught her to explain things, as if the person across the table was not stupid, but simply hadn't had cause to look at this particular problem before and deserved a clear account of what they were looking at. She went through the 6 contracts in chronological order, pointing to the clause in each one, reading the language aloud. She explained the effective date of the amendment. She showed the 3 sheriffs' sale filings and the dates they were initiated and the dates the statute said they could not legally have been initiated. She was not performing. She was not emotional or eloquent in the way that courtroom moments tend to be described afterward. She was simply precise. Precise the way a balance scale is precise. The way a properly kept ledger is precise. The numbers said what they said. The statute said what they said. The gap between the two was not an interpretation, it was a measurement. Pruitt's attorney asked his questions. He questioned her credentials. She produced her father's original accounting license and the letter from the Nashville Chamber of Commerce attesting to the 18 years J.E. Mays and Associates had operated in good standing, with D.A. Mays as named associate from 1863. He questioned her methodology. She walked through it point by point, which took 11 minutes, and at the end of which the attorney had nothing left to question. He suggested the analysis contained errors. She asked him to specify which ones and waited with her pencil ready. He couldn't specify. The room was quiet. In the back, Cal stood with his hat in his hand. He had done this before. Stood in a room while someone else did the work that mattered. He'd done it as a ranger, pulling perimeter on a negotiation, waiting for the thing to go one way or the other, and knowing that his job in those moments was to be present and not get in the way. He had learned something over 19 years about what it felt like when a thing was going to hold and when it was going to break. This was going to hold. Commissioner Aldridge read the analysis a second time. The critical sections, pages 9 through 14, without speaking. Pruitt's attorney sat very still. Pruitt himself sat beside him in a way that was trying not to be rigid and was not quite succeeding. Aldridge set the papers down. He looked at the room. "The penalty clause as written in these 6 contracts," he said, "is not enforceable under the Texas Property Code as amended January 1st, 1877. The sheriff's sales initiated after that date on properties subject to these contracts were filed in contravention of state law." He paused. "The bank's lending license is suspended pending a full review by this office. All currently active default proceedings under these contracts are stayed." In the back of the room, someone exhaled. Then several people were talking at once. Ruth Hadley's son, Frank, who had driven his mother to town and helped her into the courthouse and stood beside her through the whole proceeding, turned to look at her. She was looking at Dora. Her expression was the expression of a woman who has held something very tight for a long time and has just been given permission, carefully and in proper legal language, to set it down. Cal walked to the front of the room. Dora was speaking quietly with Oakes. She had her ledger open and was noting something, the date, the commissioner's ruling in her careful hand, because she noted everything, because that was how the world was legible. She looked up when he reached her. He didn't know what to say. There was something lodged in his chest that he couldn't quite account for. Not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Something older than that. Something that had been accumulating for 2 years in the space between what he'd known was wrong and what he'd known how to say. "Dora," he said. She waited. "You knew," he said. "From the first night. You read the clause, and you knew." "I suspected," she said. "That's different from knowing. You spent 3 weeks building a case before you told me what you'd found." "I needed to be certain," she said. "I didn't want to tell you something was possible and then be wrong." He understood that. He understood what it cost to be wrong in front of someone. He had spent 4 years understanding that. I didn't say one word, he said. At the saloon, when you arrived. She looked at him. No, she said. I've been thinking about that since the second day. I know you have. The room around them was moving, people talking, Oakes gathering documents, Aldridge conferring with his aide. Pruitt's attorney was speaking to Pruitt in a low, rapid voice, and Pruitt was looking at the floor with the expression of a man revising calculations he had considered settled. I want to draw up a document, Cal said. A partnership agreement for the ranch. Your name on the deed, equal share. He looked at her. Oakes can draft it today if you want. She considered him. That's a significant thing to offer, she said. It's accurate, he said. That's all. Something shifted in her expression, the smallest movement, the way a lamp brightens when you adjust the wick by just a fraction. She opened her ledger to a blank page. She wrote something, 2 or 3 words. I'll want to read the draft before signing, she said, and I'll have corrections. I'd be disappointed otherwise, he said. They walked out into the Uvalde afternoon. The limestone heat, the dust, the August sky going white at the edges. Ruth Hadley was waiting on the courthouse steps with her coffee tin and a look that said she had known how this was going to go since the second week in July and had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up. There are things that don't need to be said out loud. A county that has laughed at the wrong person for a month tends to go quiet in a particular way when it's been proven wrong. Not ashamed exactly, because shame requires a sustained attention that most people are too busy for, but quieter, more careful. The man who'd called out from the saloon doorway when the stage came in walked past Cal on the courthouse steps and did not look at him. That was its own kind of accounting. They drove back to the ranch in the same long afternoon silence they'd driven in before, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of 2 people with nothing to say to each other, but the silence of 2 people who have said the necessary things and are letting them settle. The chaparral stretched in every direction, the same pale limestone and cedar and distance it had always been, a country that did not give anything easily and did not apologize for that. The fence on the west pasture was still wrong. Cal was going to fix it. He now knew exactly where it should be. He pulled the wagon into the yard. They climbed down. She carried the ledger under her arm and the carpetbag in her hand, the same as the first day, minus the dust of the journey and the gray traveling dress that had been carefully pressed. He held the door. There's enough left in the coffee tin for 2 cups, he said. Then we should use it, she said, and went inside. The windmill turned. The afternoon light was the color it gets at that hour in Uvalde. The copper and amber that lasts less time than you'd like, and that you remember longer than most things. The cattle were moving in the east pasture, slow and patient, and indifferent to what had happened in town, which was fine, because that was what cattle were for. Have you ever trusted someone the rest of the world had written off? I think about that sometimes, the particular courage it takes, not to make the grand gesture, but to simply pay attention when everyone around you has decided not to. Tell me in the comments. I want to know how it turned out. Somewhere in the cedar, the mockingbird started up again. It was cycling through its whole repertoire. Other bird songs, memorized and made its own, and the Brazos turned south in the heat, and the 2 people inside the ranch house sat at the kitchen table with their coffee and their work, and the specific kind of silence that is, when you find it, one of the rarest things there is.